Good afternoon, friends all over the world. My name is Sparrow, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be your host this afternoon, or evening, or morning. I hear we have some listeners on Tuesday morning in Australia. I am thrilled to host Dr. Dimitra Fimi. She's doing a little follow-up lecture, added value to the Celtic Myth in Children's Literature course that she first did with Signum University in 2014, and it has run again this past summer. You'll notice in the handouts section of your GoToWebinar control panel, we have a PDF for you. It's full of links so that you can find Dr. Fimi's webpage, some of her current projects, and also links to the course which she ran here, including a link to an anytime audit. If you just cannot wait to do this material in the near future, I'm sure the course will run within the next year or two, but if you can't wait, get an anytime audit, which is exactly stocking stuffer sized in time for the holidays. And I should not take up our time anymore. I'm so excited. Thank you for joining us in the evening. Dr. Fimi, the floor is yours.
It's lovely to be back. It's been a while. Yeah, so it's nice to hear that the course ran again. It seems like it's had another good run and more students on it. So that's always nice to hear. Yeah, so this is a follow-up, really. Do you remember, those of you that have done the course, in that very last session, I talk about all the books that we didn't have the time to do. And there's so many of them, and this is my chance really to talk you through just two really, a part of a series and a one-off novel. And I've picked one text or two texts really. One series of texts is from the Irish tradition. The other is influenced from the Welsh tradition. So there's a nice balance really here. And we also have a male author versus a female author. So again, thinking about sort of keeping it balanced. And one author is based in the US. The other author is based actually around the corner from where I live here in Wales. So a number of you will know that when I first ran the course, it was a way for me, apart from actually sharing this material with everyone, having brilliant discussions, it was a way for me to put my head in order really and get the book sorted, which is the cover of the book you see on the opening slide there. So Celtic Myth and Contemporary Children's Fantasy, Idealization, Identity, Ideology came out from Palgrave Macmillan last March, I think, very end of last March, so a few months really, hasn't been a year yet, and it's been lovely to see it out there and have a mini launch at Aberdeen when I was there as a keynote for a George MacDonald conference back in July, and I've been absolutely over the moon because the book has just been shortlisted for the Katharine Briggs Folklore Award, which is one of the oldest awards really on literature and folklore. Yeah, it's a bit daunting actually, because some of the people who have won it in the past include Jack Zipes, Marina Warner, those sorts of giants in the field. So to even be shortlisted is a great honor, and yeah, I'll be there for the ceremony and fingers crossed. So we'll see what happens with that. But the texts I've chosen today are in the book, but they weren't in the course, and it's my chance really to share them with you, and I'm quite enthusiastic about both of them. I think they're brilliant texts. I was also very lucky after we finished with the course, and as I continued my research, to talk with a number of the authors of those texts, those alive anyway. Most of them are living authors, and it was a big change for me to be working with living authors for a change, because my other work, of course, is on Tolkien. And both of the authors of the books we're going to look at today, I have interviewed either via sort of a series of emails or face-to-face. So I've been very, very lucky to get their insights as well into the creative process and the way that they engaged with the Irish and Welsh tradition accordingly. So, okay, let's get started then and see where we are. I am going to try and do my usual thing where I'm going to take some breaks every now and then and invite questions, but don't wait for that. If you have questions as I go, type them in, and then we'll come to them when when there's a sort of natural pause I suppose, in the flow. So let's see how that goes. I do have my tea here, and I will be stopping every now and then to take a sip. It is quite cold over here at the moment. It's, you know, it is 9 o'clock at night, so yeah, forgive me, my iconoclastic tea mug, which you will see in a minute. All right, so our first text. It's actually a part, you know, we're going to look only at the first 2 books of a series of 5 books, and these are these texts are some of the more recent ones included in the book, and they are Henry Neff's The Tapestry series, and they were published from 2007 to 2014. So The Hound of Rowan was the first one that came up in 2007, then The Second Siege 2008. These are the 2 that I'm going to talk about today and that you hopefully will have read by now. And then it continues with The Fiend and the Forge in 2010, The Maelstrom in 2012, and The Red Winter in 2014. I'm not going to give you, you know, they're not going to be any spoilers. You know, I'm really stopping with the story where it is in the second book. It does get very exciting, so hopefully those of you that tried those first 2 books will go on to read the rest. Now, the series, when it was first out, when the first book was out, it was reviewers first of all compared it quite quickly with the Harry Potter books, which is sort of inevitable because it starts with with young children chosen to study in a secret school of magic, and you're thinking, right, okay, I know this story before, but already at this point, you know, reviewers were recognizing a unique tone and actually at the beginnings of a very coherent mythological background. So what Henry Neff, I think, does really, really well is world building, and the relationship between story and world building works brilliantly. So the story, of course, you know, as I said, it starts sort of predictably, but it goes off in very unpredictable, daring, sort of challenging routes. And I think it actually, what is interesting about this whole series is that it sort of challenges some of the expectations of fantasy. And if you remember, those of you that did the course, we talked quite a lot about the structures of fantasy, the sort of categories of fantasy, etc. So yeah, it's complex world building, and at the same time a very powerful, very memorable sort of conclusion to the series. I'm not going to say any more about it. You know, this is up to you to read it now. The other thing about Henry Neff is that apart from being a writer, he's also an illustrator. So you can't see much from the covers here because these were done by cover designers, but inside the book each chapter is accompanied by an illustration, and there are some kind of large whole page illustrations as well. I've only given you a couple here with Henry's permission from one that I used in my website before, so I knew it was okay to use that one. All right, so this is a series that hybridizes genres, and again, I think this is something that J.K. Rowling does very well as well. But here we have, apart from the school story and of course fantasy, we have elements of science fiction there. We have elements of historical fiction. There are a number of different things that are meshed together really to create this series. But it does read, you know, overall as classic fantasy. You know, it has the big themes, you know, the big sort of structures that we know from high fantasy. Myth and folklore, of course, are very much part of the material that it's drawing upon to create this world, and you know, a rather interesting sort of bondage, recognition, and healing pattern. Again, we've looked at this pattern before in the course, and again, I'm not going to say that this is a series only inspired by the Irish tradition, because there are elements of a number of other mythological traditions really here. So there's Greek and Roman elements, there is Old Norse for sure, some Finnish, Hebrew, Egyptian, you know, a number of different traditions are sort of blended together, especially when the scope of the books becomes global, really. But the Irish material are at the heart of the series. So as we find out, you know, quite soon in the second book, that the main protagonist of the novel, Max, is a descendant of Irish divinities. The ancient school, you know, in the prehistory of the series, Solus, of which Rowan Academy, the school where Max goes to in New England, is only a memory, sort of vague memory of this older school. Well, Solus was built in Ireland, and it was built by the Tuatha De Danann. And again, we've done a number of stories of the medieval material in which these semi-divine, sort of semi-divine characters really figure. And there are a number of central characters from Irish medieval literature that feature in the tapestry, like Lugh, Scathach, the Fomorian. Later on, you know, again, I'm not going to give away too much, but the Morrigan makes an appearance as well. So, yeah, a number of characters that we'd recognise from the Irish material covered in this course and elsewhere, of course. So, the starting point really for the tapestry and its engagement with the Celtic tradition is the way that Henry Neff uses the figure of Cuchulainn as a major hero, but at the same time as the foil, as the calque of his own young hero, the young teenage hero Max McDaniels. So there's a sort of 19th century illustration of Cuchulainn on the left. On the right, actually, we have Max McDaniels in battle. Again, this is from a later book. Again, I'm not going to give away too much here, but this is Henry's own illustration of him as a warrior. You know, again, very young boy really there, but in that position. But again, Cuchulainn's a very young boy in the story, so we'll come to that in a second. So the mythological foundation really of the tapestry series really does rely on this loose adaptation. You know, I'm not going to say that again this is word for word or a retelling of the life of Cuchulainn, but it is a loose adaptation of the life and deeds of Cuchulainn, who is, you know, by all measures really the best known medieval Irish hero. So the moment Max McDaniels is introduced in the Hound of Rowan, he's immediately aligned with Cuchulainn. You know, there's already, you know, from that first chapter, we already start making links, especially if you know sort of your Irish texts really. So we first meet Max on the day that he has his vision that marks him as a potential. So children who have this, you know, this inherited spark of magic from, you know, the ancient powers that once looked after the world, and this is, you know, the mythological, the invented mythology really here, are usually at the point of, you know, at the threshold of growing up. You know, they have this vision, and they're given the chance to join the magical school, the Rowan Academy. So Max has his vision at the Art Institute of Chicago, and this is a place where he goes with his father, the very first chapter, to celebrate his mother's birthday. There's already a mystery there because his mother isn't there. She's disappeared a few years before, but his father and him still celebrate her birthday on the same day by going to her favorite place, the Arts Institute of Chicago. And in that very first encounter really, Max sees a tapestry, and this is really, of course, where the name of the whole series is taken. And this is a tapestry that it's elaborate. It's got a whole scene on it, you know, a depiction of a particular story. It's pretty obvious there is a story behind it, and it's strangely illuminated. So that's what he sees. This is from the first chapter. The lights and colour shifted to form golden interlacing patterns that framed three strange glowing words near the top. Time Boculi. Centered below these words was the beautifully woven image of a bull in a pasture, surrounded by dozens of sleeping warriors. A host of armed men were approaching from the right. A trio of black birds wheeled in the sky above. Overlooking the scene from a nearby hill was the silhouette of a tall man clutching a spear. Okay, now at this point we're told nothing else, right? So all we've got really here is the title, Time Boculi, and, you know, for those in the know, for those that know the text, or, you know, that the title means something to, you know, it's pretty obvious straight away that this is a scene from the Cattle Raid of Cooley, probably the best known, again, sort of heroic tale of the Irish medieval material, and it is clearly here the scene here is the weakened men of Ulster who are under the curse of Macha, and they cannot fight, you know, while Queen Maeve and her army are approaching, and so the only person who can defend the bull is Cuchulainn. He's on his own. He's not affected by this curse. So, as I said, none of this is explained, although much later in the book, Max does get access to a book, you know, of Irish mythology, and he reads that bit of the story. It's only then, really, that he makes the connection between the scene that he sees that marks him, as I said, as this magical person, and Cuchulainn himself. So, this is quite, you know, quite a deliberate and quite a, you know, quite significant statement, I think, you know, to start the series with evoking the Táin and its larger-than-life era. Really, Cuchulainn is, you know, well known beyond this text, and again, you know, we already get a sense that Max isn't just any magical person. He isn't just any potential. You know, there's something special about him, just like with Cuchulainn. He's not just any hero of the medieval Irish material. And we've learned pretty soon, actually, that Max is touched by old magic. He is, you know, as one of the characters calls him, a prince even among our magical kind, even among our kind. He's special even above, you know, the spark of magic that all the other children in the school and the, you know, the adults in that world sort of share. And we learn as well, right there from the very first chapter, that Max has always been battling with his lurking presence inside him. He calls it a huge and wild presence that he sort of fears a bit, but it seems to overwhelm him at times. So as he arrives at the Rowan Academy, his physical capabilities come to blossom very quickly, and it's, as I said, pretty clear that he's special, even beyond, you know, the magic, really, his magical course. So all of this now is straight away, and these early stages of his life, and the plot of the first book is actually following quite close the boyhood deeds of Cuchulainn, the Macin Rada con Cuchulainn, and this is really a section of the Táin, you know, an early section of the Táin, and then there are a number of, do you remember the Remshella, the four tales associated with the Táin, that most of them are sort of later tales, but they try to explain bits of the story. So in the boyhood deeds of Cuchulainn, and you know, that's a pretty classic literary topos of the heroic career. We get the boyhood deeds of Finn in the Fenian tradition. Cuchulainn shows his abilities with a number of games and sort of training. Things like he shows his abilities in the small javelin or the dart, in the ball, and in games such as hurling. So we see straight away that he supersedes, you know, all of the other boys of his age, and he can do much better than them. You know, he can even compete with grown men as a young boy. And similarly, as he arrives at Rowan Academy, which is the School of Magic, Max soon again overtakes all of his peers in terms of physical abilities. He doesn't realize he's doing it, but he sort of allows that inner power, that inner wildness to take over him, and he unwittingly uses what's called in the mythology of this world body amplification, and which means that he sort of he suddenly becomes super fast, super powerful. You know, it's as if he goes into a superhero sort of mode, but doesn't quite realize how he's doing it. And this is during a match of Euclidean football, which is, again, the special sort of game, magical game played in the school. So he's, from that point of view, you know, he's already sort of excelling among peers or among equals. And at the same time, then later on, we see him excelling in the course, and the course is, again, there's the little science fiction element really here, a simulation environment that generates scenarios for students to train and hone their physical abilities. It's a bit like, yeah, simulation chamber, or whatever you want to call it, a sort of, yeah, virtual reality training set. And he just, you know, passes all the different levels, you know, very quickly for his age. And we also see him leaping exceedingly high. And again, that's something that we see Cuchulainn very specifically described as being able to do. You know, in one instance, Max leaps 12 feet straight up. And by the end of that first book, he tops the fitness measures of the entire school. So you see the interesting blend here between the medieval storytelling and the character, and at the same time the sort of hybrid meshing that's going on in the series with those slightly science fiction-y elements. Now, by the end of the Hound of Rowan, Max has been bloodied for the first time. You know, he kills his first Vi, and Vi's are sort of, I suppose, something like the orcs in the Tolkien world. They are those monstrous beings. They're wolf-like creatures that can shapeshift, and they're very scary. And we see an interesting development of them later. I'm not going to say a word more. You need to read the rest of the books. But if you remember in Cuchulainn's story, Cuchulainn kills Cuchulainn's hound by throwing his ball into the mouth of the hound and tearing out its entrails. And this is why, you know, the boy called Setanta is actually given the name Cuchulainn, the Hound of Cuchulainn, because for a while, you know, because he killed that great hound, he says, don't, you know, and the owner is very distressed. He says, don't worry about it. I'll be your hound. I'll look after your property. So he becomes the Hound of Cuchulainn. Well, Max, when he kills his first Vi, he's forcing golden apple down its throat, and that's what sort of causes death. So that replicates, in a way, Cuchulainn's killing of the Hound of Cuchulainn. It's not, you know, there's some interesting things to notice here about wolves, hounds, wolfhounds. What's going on there? We'll come back to that in a minute, so bear with me for now. And by the end of the book, I think, well, it doesn't quite happen at the end of this book, but we've got it in the title, and he's called that at the beginning of the second book. Max is definitely the Hound of Rowan. He's the champion of the school, and he's called that right at the beginning of the second siege, which is the beginning of the second book. So this justifies, of course, the title of the first book, The Hound of Rowan, but also a very secure link, I think, with the Irish material. So you see that there is a sort of clear following of Cuchulainn's heroic career by Max. In the second siege, Max is actually singled out from his friends. He's now, you know, well beyond just excelling, and he receives advanced training in the course. You know, we see him doing particularly well, and despite his youth, despite he's just a boy really, he's sworn into the Red Branch, you know, a select group of agents who protect Rowan and its people. Now, the Red Branch is again a term from the Irish material. It's a name that's often used collectively to refer to the Ulster heroes. But clearly here Henry Neff is doing something very clever. Just instead of just them being a band of warriors, because of the word branch, you know, he appropriates this term to convey this idea of I don't know, a branch of the FBI maybe, or something like this. So they're secret agents, and they are the protectors of the magical people, really, not just the school. But at the same time, Max follows in the footsteps of Cuchulainn and the later training of Cuchulainn, because in that second book he also visits the She. And the She is the other world, really. He goes to this other world place, which is clearly geographically aligned to Ireland. It seems to be a version of Ireland in the past, you know, the medieval past, that he is visiting. And there he's trained, just like Cuchulainn, he's trained by the female warrior Scathach. He's trained to use particular combat techniques, the apple feat, the summon leap, the little dart feat. All of those are listed in the Toyn. We don't actually hear the names of those techniques until, again, the beginning of the third book, when he's interrogated. He's asked, what did you learn in the She? And then he gives his catalogue of feats. But we do see him, you know, we do see him being trained by Scathach. And by the yeah, okay, sorry. And by the end of the second book, he's now not just, you know, the Hound of Rowan, he's the champion of Rowan when it comes to a big war. Things are becoming much more serious now. Rowan is besieged, you know, the Dark Lord of this particular series is gaining power, he's gaining allies, and there's a big sort of siege of Rowan in which Max is really the only defender of the school. And what we seem to have here is what we seem to have is him becoming, you know, that hero that he witnessed on the tapestry all of this time ago at the beginning of the first book. He is now the only one who hasn't fallen sick as a result of the curse of the witches, just like Cuchulainn has not been affected by the curse of Macha, and he's the only one who can now defend his people against a very powerful Dark Lord Astaroth. He's quite seductive, Dark Lord Astaroth, isn't he? He's the arch-villain of this fantasy, and you know, again, he develops quite in interesting ways as well later on. I think I just missed something. Yes, I did. Sorry. If I go back to Scathach and the training really that Max receives, just like Cuchulainn, from her. The other thing that's similar there in the She is the entrance to the castle where Scathach trains him. Again, both Cuchulainn and Max try to cross the bridge a couple of times. They fail at the beginning. Actually, Cuchulainn tries 3 times. Max does it in 2. So they fail, and then they're jeered for being too young, but eventually they both leap over the bridge, and it astonishes everyone. So again, that is a very iconic scene, really, that both of them are seen to be enacting or reenacting in the case of Max. So yeah, so as I said, Max is the sole defender of Rowan, just like Cuchulainn in that tapestry scene that Max witnesses at the beginning, is the only defender of Ulster and the bull, and Max's old magical blood is what excludes him from the curse of the witches, and he becomes, you know, a Calc really for Cuchulainn. And of course, you know, those of you who have finished with that second book, you will know that there is a sort of defeat really there. You know, he's forced to strike a deal with his opponents. And I think that's what makes him really interesting. He's very powerful, but he's not completely invincible. You know, there are limits to his power, and of course, you know, with the Cuchulainn story, we do know that eventually he does fall, and he does fall. You know, with a raise fall of him at the end. Okay, so you know, there are a number of apart from just following the heroic career of Cuchulainn, which Max seems to be doing point by point really here. There are a number of other things that make the two characters very, very similar, and Henry Neff is really consciously, I think, drawing on these links. So a sort of striking similarity between Cuchulainn and Max is how young they are. Okay, and we forget that, you know, because Cuchulainn is such a powerful hero. But he really is, in the books, a boy. You know, he's a teenager. He is often, jilted for that, or he's not taken seriously because of that. And then, of course, his opponents have to think twice or sort of take back their words, in a way. But he's a bit unruly as well. He's a bit of a difficult teenager. And there is something funny about the way that Cuchulainn is portrayed as a beardless boy. So much so that opponents say, well, I'm not fighting him, he's only just a boy. And then, of course, you know, all of this turns around, and he's much more capable than any of the grown men that he's fighting. Well, Max here is, again, literally a teenager, and he remains. So throughout the series, I mean, we do see him growing, but that is, you know, the figure of Max is very much the figure of the teenager in those formative years. So in the same way that Cuchulainn is underestimated by his opponents, but then proves them wrong, you know, he proves to be a formidable warrior. That's exactly what happens with Max as well. And his young age really underlines his extraordinary powers. The other similarity really here is the image of the wolfhound. So I sort of started talking about that a bit earlier. It's a wolf, it's a hound, it's a wolfhound, you know, what is it? Well, throughout the series, Max is haunted by a dream, the dream of the wolfhound. He actually, first of all, has it, you know, at the very beginning, just after he's had that vision, you know, of that tapestry, and the wolf always asks him the same question, and actually that vision happens quite a few times throughout the series. What are you about? Answer quick, or I'll gobble you up. And he does get an answer, you know, Max does answer eventually, but that doesn't happen until very much, you know, very, very close to the end of the whole series. So again, I'm not going to tell you too much about that. But the wolfhound, in a way, is a great metaphor for Max's search of identity, and this question: who are you? You know, what are you about? What, you know, how can I know you? is a very typical theme really for teenage fiction, finding one's own identity, and it's a device through which Neff, I think, continues to explore or challenge really the heroic ideal, the ideal of the hero, of the all-powerful hero, because the hero here is an interesting character. The hero is often in a liminal position. Heroes are often associated with boundaries, with thresholds. They are there to protect, but they are sometimes too powerful and can become dangerous. So if you look at my last bullet point in this slide, in Irish, the word cu, which is the first part of Cuchulainn's name, you remember the Hound of Cuchulainn, the hound, a wild dog. Cu actually might mean either dog or hound, or the same word also means wolf, and it therefore is a great way of encompassing this double nature of the hero, because a guardian dog, on its positive side, a guardian dog is tame. And it protects, but if a dog goes wild, or the dogs in their wild state before they were sort of domesticated, so if they revert back to their wolfish nature, because there is of course a sort of biological affinity between wolves and hounds, it can become a threat. It can become something that can savage, rather than protect, or destroy rather than protect. And there are, numerous stories, and there would have been, of course, back in the Middle Ages, numerous stories of tame dogs, protected dogs going wild and sort of losing it and sort of reverting back to a more, more savage sort of nature. So the wolfhound associated with a heroic figure is ambivalent, and I think that's something that we see also with Max. So Carrie and Koch are really here commenting on Cuchulainn rather than Max, of course, and they say that the hound's usefulness depends upon its ability to distinguish between friend and foe, insider and outsider. The loss of this ability to distinguish can make the warrior a menace to his own people. Cuchulainn, returning from a raid beyond the border, threatens to kill everyone in the stronghold until disarmed by ruse. And this is one of those scenes in which Cuchulainn comes back, and he's so taken over by the sort of heat of battle, he's completely sort of in the zone, in a trance even, that he nearly continues the killing when he comes back home, until, if you remember that scene, all of the the women of Tara go there and sort of they uncover their breasts, they reveal their breasts, and he's so shamed by seeing them naked that, he sort of cools down. And then they have to pour water over him and sort of cool him down, literally, from this battle fury. And if you remember also, Cuchulainn goes into that warp spasm, he bodily changes into this, rather grotesque, really, creature when he goes into this battle fury. And just like Cuchulainn, Max also goes into that sort of warp spasm. Remember, I said in the earlier book, he goes through body amplification without realizing it. His body expands, in ways that he cannot control. And perhaps, his body amplification in the first few books isn't as dramatic as Cuchulainn, but we do see him later on, and we do see him at the verge of losing control. And I'll leave it at that. I'm not going to tell you, as I said, much about what happens after, but think about that as you read the rest of the series, and how how this more sort of ambivalent element of the hero is explored later on. Okay, I'm going to stop for a second. Let's see if there are any questions so far. I'm going to take a sip of my tea. Okay, Sparrow, I can't see anything here. Is there anything I should be seeing that I can't see?
Dr. Fimi, I see one question that I will read aloud to you, if I may.
Yes, please.
And this is from Emily Alston. Since you mentioned that Neff does his own illustrations, do you think that authors can bring something unique to a work when they illustrate it themselves? And if so, what? Emily says, I am an artist and interested in the relationship between text and visuals.
I think in the sort of fantasy that Neff writes, it can be a very powerful thing to be able to do. I don't think it's not a completely unheard of thing. Tolkien was very much into visualizing his world, you know, and we do recognize him today as an artist in a way that maybe he didn't recognize himself. But this visualization of an invented world, I think, is important. And there are a number of fantasy authors with double width, maybe sketches, maybe mostly to visualize the world for themselves, you know, to help to aid the writing process. So I think it can be a very powerful tool. Now, whether their art is good enough to be presented, clearly Henry's is absolutely stunning, you know, and it really does enrich, I think, the secondary world. That's a different story. But for me, its role as a tool in developing world building can be, yeah, it can be very, very powerful, even if it is just basic diagrams or a map, you know, something like this. There is a visual element, I think, that lends itself to the art of world building. So yeah, it can be very inextricably linked, and it can be very, very potent as a tool. Yeah. Okay.
And that is it at the moment for questions. So
Excellent.
Folks, don't be shy about typing in.
Absolutely. So just a few words really more about the tapestry before I move to Darkhenge, and then don't worry, there's still time to talk about both of them in the second part, really.
Oh, Dr. Fimi, may I interrupt? I just this moment got a new question.
Okay.
Which may be what you're about to address, from Chris Swank. Mm-hmm. Does Max diverge from the Cuchulainn type in any significant way?
Right, that's a very good question, Chris. But I don't want to give away too much, shall we say? Yeah, I think if I answer that, I'm going to spoil a bit of the continuation of the series. So I might have to leave it at that. But that's something to read the rest of the series and explore for yourselves. And to me, this is one of the most interesting things. It's not so much how you interestingly sort of replicate and make a recognizable link with heroes such as Cuchulainn, but it's also what you do different with them, really. How do you bring them to a context that is contemporary and sort of makes sense, you know, because we're not really in you know, in a society that expects the sort of heroic code that you expect in a medieval Irish context. But at the same time, in a big fantasy work in which we do get big battles and big moral dilemmas, maybe you do, or maybe you don't. I'll have to leave it at that. As I said, I promised I wouldn't spoil the rest of it. Part of me really wanted to assign all 5 books for this, but I knew I had an hour and a half and it wasn't going to happen properly, so I didn't want to sort of patch it over. So yeah, hold that thought, Chris, and read the rest of the series, and maybe we'll have a little chat privately afterwards. That's all I can say for now.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So the other quick thing I wanted to say has to do with, you know, sort of the rest of the characters, really, from Irish mythology that we see here, and the progeny, you know, the idea of blood, you know, blood relations. And that's something that in the course you will have seen with characters such as the children in the Fenian Mary Cannon's, you know, Finn novels, who end up being the children of Finn himself. You know, Finn McCool ends up being the father. We get it with Alan Garner's The Owl Service and this reincarnation, you know, this blood relationship between, you know, the original characters of the Mabinogion and the children that we see. We see it in and Jenny Nemo with Gwyn as a descendant of the heroes of the Mabinogion. We see it in Susan Cooper with Arthur's own son having been transposed into the 20th century. Well, this blood relation is, of course, here as well in Henry Neff's series, in the sense that Max, you know, in the second book, ends up being a brother of Cuchulainn's. He ends up being the son of Lugh, in the same way that Cuchulainn was claimed to be the son of Lugh. So we do get this connection that it's beyond just a casual sort of similarity, really. Here there is a blood connection with the heroes of the Irish tradition, and there is also a landscape connection as well. As I said, the other world is really recognizably geographically medieval Ireland. So the links, you know, these sort of tangible links are there and are exploited in a way that is not that dissimilar really to how other Celtic-inspired fantasy is doing the same thing. So there we go. And again, you know, there's so much more we could say, but we're going to have to stop somewhere so that I can move to Katharine Fisher, and then we'll come back to both books at the end. Sparrow, anything more on this, or can I move to the next sequence?
I think we are all excited to move to the next sequence.
Okay, all right. So we're going to move to we're going to have a little transition now. Yes, from Irish material to Welsh material, and from high fantasy to lower intrusion fantasy, and from world building and sort of big conflicts to more sort of internal psychological dilemmas, rather than, you know, the big moral dilemmas or the big battles really here. And this is Katharine Fisher's Darkhenge, which was published in 2005, and it's a very different book, very different to the whole series that Henry Neff is presenting to us, and it is very much predicated upon a different series of texts, all of which, of course, those of you that have done the Celtic course will have done in a different context, really here. So in terms of the Welsh tradition, really, just like with Henry Neff, we were talking really about the Táin, and some of its Remseller, some of its foretales. What we've got with Darkhenge is the two poems from the Book of Taliesin. We've got the Pré Deianw, the Spoils of the Otherworld, the Cat Godai, the Battle of the Trees, and we also have the story of Taliesin, the tale of Taliesin, known as Historia Taliesin or Hanes Taliesin, depending on the manuscript, which was in Lady Guest's first translation of the Mabinogion. So a little bit of background on this text, just to remind you about them. The Pré Deianw is a poem that's narrated by the Taliesin persona, and it's really a story about Arthur, King Arthur and his men, who sailed to this otherworldly fortress, you know, this otherworldly stronghold, in order to rescue a prisoner and to acquire a magic cauldron. Well, the Cat Godai is that pretty obscure, pretty elusive poem, one of those poems you really don't know what to do with it. Seems, you know, it's quite mysterious. It is also narrated by Taliesin, partially at least, and it's about an army of trees and shrubs that are marching to war, and they're summoned by the magician Gwydion. But at least part of that poem is narrated by the Taliesin persona. There's a break in the manuscript, and then you know, scholars are arguing on whether the rest of the poem is also narrated by Taliesin, or whether we've got Arthur himself sort of narrating part of it. The evidence isn't conclusive, but there we are. And the Historia Taliesin, or the Hanes Taliesin, it's actually not in the modern translations of the Mabinogion. So Lady Guest included it in her very first translation, that very iconic, famous translation, but it was omitted later on, and it definitely is still omitted. So in the latest Sean Davis translation, it's not there, because the tale of Taliesin is much later in terms of all the other Mabinogion stories. So some of the Mabinogion stories are very early, so the fourth branches of the Mabinogion are the earliest, but even the romances, or the, you know, the Yvain, the Lady of the Fountain, all of those tales which are later are still much earlier than the Taliesin story, which is actually the earliest manuscripts we've got are 16th century, so a good few centuries later than the latest of the other tales. Some other of the manuscripts we've got from that story are 18th century, so, you know, it is definitely a sort of early modern rather than medieval story, but it has become, you know, it is still part of the Welsh tradition, and of course it tallies up with the Taliesin story, the Taliesin poems that I'm mentioning here that are earlier, of course, so from the 9th to 12th century as far as we can date them, and they're both, those poems, they're both included in the 12th century manuscript, the Book of Taliesin. Okay, I'll go into detail in a minute on how these texts are used, but again, a bit of background really here. I've got some nice pictures for you to have a look at. Well, the setting here, and usually actually for Katharine Fisher, is not Wales. It is actually Avebury, which is in Wiltshire, not that far actually into England, but into England. And the location is probably that of the best known prehistoric stone circle after Stonehenge. So everybody knows Stonehenge. This is the second most famous one in Britain. So that's the photograph at the bottom. So there's Avebury there. It's a massive henge of stones. There's an outer circle and an inner circle. It is quite a stunning location, actually. Now, there is this, and actually Katharine, I've had a lovely sort of conversation with her about the book, was telling me that she goes there a lot, and she walks there a lot, so she knows that, and she's very, very familiar with this landscape. But at the same time, she was very much fascinated by the picture at the top, and this is Seahenge in Norfolk, which was excavated in 1998. And it really is a henge of tree stubs, really. So we've got this wood pillars around an upside down tree stump. And the reason why goodness knows, monuments like that, or sites, or particular sites like that, would have been possibly all over Britain, possibly all over Europe, but they don't survive. You know, wood is a perishable sort of material. But in this particular area in Norfolk, because of the way the tide is, because of the way the sand and the sort of quality of the soil is, it's preserved the wood, and you can see it. You can see it when the tide, you know, goes out. You could see it, you know, at the point of excavation. Definitely, you could. So this is a picture of how it looked. And it is rather stunning, you know, and actually, apparently, a number of people locally knew it long before it was excavated. You know, you'd see it at the tide. So Katharine Fisher was quite fascinated by that. She, as I said, knew Avebury quite well. So she creates Darkhenge, which is, again, this wooden structure with the upside-down tree in the middle. So the novel focuses on two siblings, a brother and a sister. We have Rob and Chloe, and Rob actually is the one who has to go in the underworld, underneath, you know, in the underworld, via this upside down oak tree in the middle of Katharine Fisher's imaginary timber henge, which is close to Avebury. So he needs, you know, in the novel, he realizes that he needs to go in the underworld and save Chloe. And Chloe, his sister, has had an accident riding her horse, and she's lying in a hospital bed in a coma. So we have the journey underground, very typical motif in a number of mythological traditions, actually. You know, in the classical tradition, this is the common catabasis, the sort of descend down to the underworld. You know, there's something that reminds you here of, I don't know, the Orpheus and Eurydice story, you know, going in the underworld to sort of bring his wife back, or the Persephone and Demeter story, Persephone sort of being abducted by Hades and then reclaimed by her mother for at least part of the year, maybe not all of the year. So Katharine was telling me that she was thinking about these sort of stories to begin with. However, in the process of writing the novel, it took a Celtic turn. You know, that's how she described it to me. It took a Celtic route, because she felt that Rob needed a guide in his descent to the underworld. She said he needed a sort of Virgil to his Dante, which I thought was a lovely expression to use. And it was not until Katharine continued working on the first few chapters when she realized that the guide, you know, that mysterious druid who leads Rob to the underworld, Vetch, is none else than Taliesin of the Welsh tradition. It suddenly clicked, you know, and it sort of worked as a allusion and as a way of sort of weaving in the story of Cuchulainn and Taliesin. Now, Taliesin himself, of course, in the Welsh tradition, is associated with the other world because of that poem that I talked about before, Pray Day Anuvin, the spoils of the other world, in which he accompanies Arthur and his men to this otherworld island to capture that cauldron and rescue that prisoner. So actually the poem is narrated in his voice, as I was saying before. But at the same time, the underworld, or the unworld, which is how Fisher translates really Anuvin, fits quite well also with the Welsh tradition of Annwn as underground. So there are a number of places where Annwn is. One of them is underground. So it sort of all comes together really, and it sort of makes sense. So the tale of Taliesin actually provides a number of structural elements to the story. If you remember now the story of Taliesin, it starts with a young boy, Cuchulainn, who is asked by Ceridwen, the witch, to keep on steering her brew. So Ceridwen has prepared a potion of inspiration and of wisdom for her son, who's very ugly. So she's brewing this potion to give him this extra wisdom and knowledge. But of course, Gwion gets splashed by a few drops from the cauldron, and he burns his thumb. His thumb puts it in his mouth, and of course now he's tasted the cauldron, so the power goes to him. And this is a motif, if you remember, in the Celtic fancy course. We discussed this as a motif that we see in a number again of different traditions. So what Sigurd does with a dragon's heart, where he's told, do not taste the heart, just cook it. But of course he burns his thumb again, puts it in his mouth. We see it with Finn McCool also, and burning his thumb in the salmon of wisdom. So this isn't a specifically Celtic motif. It actually exists in a number of sort of neighbor cultures, interestingly. But of course, as I said, this is a sort of late story that plays with that motif. So in Darkhenge, when Vetch is called to this world, we realize later on he's been invited into this world by the Rainbow people, who are a group of neo-pagans who see Avebury as a significant place. And again, we have a lot of neo-pagan activity here in Britain, both in Avebury and in Stonehenge, quite famously. Vetch first appears as a swallow who's hunted by a hawk. Then he appears as a hare who's pursued by a greyhound, and finally he's a fish chased by an otter. And actually in that last scene, in the haze of the falling rain, Rob says that he grasps the fish, which turns into the fingers of a man, and in the distance he sees the otter changing into a woman. So these transformations, of course, are very, they echo very closely and deliberately the forms that Gwion and Ceridwen take in the Tale of Taliesin. So when Ceridwen realizes that he has tasted the potion, she goes for him, and he changes, and he changes into a swallow, she changes into a hawk, etc., etc. And of course, in the Tale of Taliesin, we have a final transformation in which Gwion becomes a grain of wheat, but Ceridwen becomes a hen and eats him up. That is the bit, that Katharine Fisher doesn't include. But clearly, this is a very deliberate evocation of the transformations of Taliesin. So this is the shape-shifting is the first intrusion of the numinous, of the supernatural, on the landscape of Avebury. At the same time, Vetch is quite clearly identified as Taliesin right from the beginning of the novel, because his first words are adapted from the Cat Could Die, from the Battle of the Trees. I have been in many forms, he says, a blue salmon, a stag, a roebuck on the mountain, the foam of the Nine Wave, a moth in a lantern, a harp note on the wind. Before I was born, I lived. After I die, I will born. Now, the Cat Could Die, and a number of poems actually from the Book of Taliesin, have this sort of mysterious, rather, religious overtones to them, and they seem to be hiding some sort of secret, or to be alluding to a number of other stories that the contemporary audience might have recognized. But of course, again, this is a deliberate evocation of Taliesin here. He does paraphrase parts of the Cat Could Die, and another poem too, as well, from the same book, the Anga Kivindau, the chair of Ceridwen. And then the other thing that we see is that his physical characteristics link him with Gwion or Taliesin, because Vetch has a peculiar star-shaped scar over the end of one eyebrow, and it looks bright in the sun, says Katharine Fisher, and that is actually the meaning of the name Taliesin. Lady Guest translates it as radiant brow. So again, that is a very deliberate evocation of this character. And he explains to Rob later on, as I told you, one of the poet's gifts, one of the 3 hot splashes of the cauldron. This is the 3 burns that he's got on the back of his hand from his encounter with, the cauldron, the 3 splashes where he's burned. He held up his right hand and turned it over. Rob saw that the back was burnt. 3 fearsome scars lacerated the white skin. Knowledge costs, Vetch said quietly, as you're finding out. So there is also here a bit of the figure of the tortured sort of artist, the tortured poet, who has to sort of struggle, with words. He has to struggle with his art and has to steal inspiration in this case. You know, that is true, I suppose, both of the Tale of Taliesin and Vetch in Darkhenge. So this is, again, a very, very deliberate, very structural way of looking at these characters. And of course, what we realize quite soon is that Ceridwen herself also has a reincarnated version in the novel. And she's Claire, the archaeologist who has excavated Darkhenge. She's excavated this circle of timber, which becomes the entrance to the Underworld that Vetch leads Rob down there. And it seems that the two of them are already in the real world. They are in a clash. So we've got the serious, intellectual, scientific, archaeologist Claire, who sort of has rejected all of the sort of the hippie stuff, that, as she describes them, of the neo-pagans, and at the same time Vetch, who seems to validate really, the spiritual aspect of all of these beliefs and practices. So we have sort of, inspiration, so spirituality versus science, possibly here. So there's a major clash. But of course, once they go in the underworld, Claire does revert back to the goddess, to Ceridwen, who holds, the power of art in her hand, and she's pretty miffed because Vetch, Taliesin, has stolen away that inspiration. We'll come back to that in a minute. Hopefully we'll explain what's going on there. Now, the other thing that comes from the Welsh tradition that works brilliantly, I think, in this novel in terms of imagery and poetry, really, is Annwn and the Seven Kais. So Fisher's depiction of the Underworld of Annwn is shaped by Prey Dew an Uven, by the poem of the Spoils of the Otherworld. And in the poem, the Otherworld is called Caer Sidi, and the poem also goes on to mention six other Caers, six other Caeri, that would be in Welsh, 6 other forts. So, and there are different interpretations here. Does the poem really refer to 7 different castles in 7 different otherworldly islands? So do we have an influence here from the tradition of the Irish Imrama, of the sort of this idea that there are voyages to a series of otherworld islands, or, as some other scholars have claimed, Caer Sidi, there's one fortress only, but it's got different names. Again, the poem isn't clear about whether we're talking about one castle with 7 different names or 7 different castles. And Catherine Fisher's gone with the 7 different castles really here, which is very much close to the interpretation of what's going on in the poem, but by two scholars, or I don't know, sort of creative scholars, shall we say, of the Celtic material, and that's Robert Graves in The White Goddess, and again the White Goddess came up in the Celtic course as well, and the other one is John Matthews in Taliesin, the Last Celtic Shaman, which is a book from 2002, just before, a couple of years before Darkhenge. Now, what's going on there? Well, in the interpretation of Robert Graves and of Matthews, there are seven different fortresses, and in Matthews's interpretation specifically, he interprets these fortresses as being within concentric circles. So this is the diagram he gives in his book. So in the outer circle there's the first castle, then you go further in, you find the next one, then the next one, then the next one, all the way through into the 7th castle, and the 7th, the chair of the throne of Ceridwen. And in there he sees the poem as a shamanic sort of poem in which the poet sort of reaches different levels of spirituality and consciousness, and at the middle he becomes this master of his art. Well, the modern scholarship does not agree with any of this. It is, we see much more sort of Marge Taycock, who's done the most recent new edition and translation of Prey Dew an Uven, has shown how clearly the medieval poem is engaging with texts such as Ovid's Metamorphoses. There's definitely classical allusions there, with historical texts such as those by Isidore de Seville. So it's a very intertextual poem, really, and a very knowing poem. There is this sense of a very learned poet who's showing off his knowledge. But with interpreters or sort of scholars such as Matthews or such as Robert Graves, there's something hidden and mysterious in this poem, and they're trying to interpret it as a shamanic sort of voyage, or as some sort of symbolic vision of something far beyond, you know, what we see on the surface. As I said, you know, there is sort of serious sort of scientific scholarship on the one hand, and more sort of creative mythologizing that's going on with Graves and Matthews. And you can't blame somebody who's writing creatively in engaging more with the more imaginative interpretations of the poem. But there we are. So she goes with this concentric circles interpretation and the different kais. And Vetch is actually telling Rob all of this. He's explaining there are 7 fortresses, 7 kais, each stronger, deeper inside. And then he lists them. She's passed through Royal Caer, and this is Glass, the Glass Caer. The others are the Turning Castle, the Spiral Castle, the Gloomy Castle, the Woven Caer, and the last one, Caer City itself, the Circle of Ice and Fire. At the heart of the 7th is a chair, the throne of Annwn. Whoever sits in it rules the Unworld. So she's going, you know, with that interpretation, and clearly she takes then Chloe and the King of the Unworld on the one hand, and then Rob and Vetch behind them, chasing after them through those different Caers. And the names of the Caers she's using here are based on, well, they are based on the poem, you know, but they're based on Matthews's and Robert Graves' translations of those particular fortresses in the poems. So I did, you know, that's one of the questions I asked her, you know, did you look for the most faithful translation really there? What was it that interested you? And she said, well, actually, no, I was more interested in the names that have more potential for creative responses. Of course she would, you know, as I said, she's a creative writer, and she's done a brilliant job with them, I think. So we have, first of all, the Royal Caer, which has those endless corridors. It's stone flagged, it's cobwebbed, and in that Caer, Chloe is offered food. She's offered salmon, hazelnuts, apples. All of those, again, those of you that have done the Celtic course will recognize them as food associated with the Irish and Welsh otherworld tradition. And wisely, Chloe refuses to eat the food of the otherworld. You know, this is common in many traditions. Don't eat the food of the dead. It's not a good thing. You're stuck there. You know, remember the Persephone myth as well. Then after that, they go into the Glass Caer, the Caer Wydr, which is made of this greenish glass, you know, corresponding to the Welsh word, you know, wydr, which is used for blue and green, really. The Turning Castle is an interesting one because it's 4-cornered, it's built on timber inside with 2 circular rampants of timber, and it keeps on turning round, it keeps on revolving. And the idea is, at least in Matthew's interpretation, you can't find the door, you know, you keep on losing the door. Spiral Castle, Spiral Castle, does that remind you of anything? Lloyd Alexander used Spiral Castle as well, again from, you know, used it from the same poem. But, you know, that's an aside, let me not go down that route as well. It's another can of worms. But Spiral Castle, again, Catherine Fisher really does a wonderful job here, because if you think about a spiral, it is a giant seashell. That's what that castle is. You go down the spiral of the shell in the middle of a lake, and all of the wells have, you know, have this iridescence and this gleaming, beautiful descriptions. She's very powerful in her imagery. And Chloe and the King reach the seashell, that giant seashell, via boat, which is made of what seemed like an enormous yellow plastic cup with an oar like a bent spoon. And we realize that these are remembrances of leftover sort of pots of ice cream for a picnic that Rob and Chloe had as children close to this area. And Rob realizes that the location is near Silbury Hill on the banks of the Kennet, again close to Avebury. And again here Fisher follows Robert Graves in identifying Spiral Castle with Silbury Hill. So this isn't just engaging with a medieval text, this is actually a whole chain of transmissions and interpretations that she's engaging with. Remember, these stories are always coming through a number of hoops, you know, they've jumped through a number of hoops. Then we've got Gloomy Castle, again a name that Graves translates as that, and it's made of a solid wall of darkness. It's called a vacuum, a wall of nothingness. It has no door, and when Rob enters from above, actually, because that's the only way to get in, he gets these very disturbing images of a distorted, the hospital corridor where Chloe is, a distorted memory of a house in a fairy tale illustration, and finally the Windmill Hill Long Barrow close to Avebury. So the Gloomy Castle ends up being a tomb. you know, which is claustrophobic, it's suffocating, it's very, very apposite for the name, really. Then we have a castle that doesn't exist in the poem, and that's the woven castle, the woven kai. This is from Fisher's own imagination, but again, I think it works really, really well in the context of what's come before. So she imagines this as a castle that doesn't have solid walls, but is a knitted castle made out of rope or wool. And perhaps that's a reference to Chloe's mother in the hospital knitting, you know, trying to sort of alleviate her stress and worry by knitting. So I think there is a link there with that. And by the time Chloe and Rob reach the centre, Caer Seithi itself, we have this snow-covered landscape. We have a vision of Avebury as it was in the past, you know, complete with prehistoric people and, you know, ancient hunters with spears. And there's rings of fire all around. And at the centre is the chair of Ceridwen. And this is, you know, this is an image of the chair, again, as envisioned by John Matthews in his interpretation. So Pré Anúfin is really structuring the sort of journey through the underworld and the places that the two children, you know, young teenagers, I suppose, the brother and sister, are going through. Chloe, the king of the underworld, and then Rob and Vetch following them, and then Claire keeps on coming up and sort of stopping them or sort of interfering with them all the way through. So this is the Pré Anú. Then we have the Cad Godai, the Battle of the Trees. These again mysterious poem in which the trees and bushes, you know, sort of go to war. You know, they literally walk up and walk out and march to war. That is also a poem that is quite mysterious. It feels like it must be, you know, it must be referring to something very symbolic. There's again a number of interpretations. Clearly, there are allusions to stories we've lost in this poem. It's one of those frustrating ones, unfortunately. But again, Fisher seems to go with one of Robert Graves's interpretations, one of Robert Graves's theories, in which he claimed that the trees that go to battle in this poem are supposedly a secret code in which trees stand for letters, and each tree and each letter is associated with a period of the year. So he claimed that each tree stands for a letter, and there's a secret alphabet, and what this alphabet and this secret calendar associated with specific months, the secret alphabet and calendar spell out the hidden religion of the goddess, which the Christian religion was trying to sort of suffocate, really. So he argued that the Battle of the Trees described in the poem is not really a real battle at all, but there's the quote there, it's a battle fought intellectually in the heads and with the tongues of the learned. He saw it as a battle to defend and transmit the ancient Druidic religion against the Christian church. Now, evidence of all of this, there's none. This is Robert Graves. He's notorious for taking huge leaps of faith of a material in a way. I mean, the White Goddess is an amazing book, but at the same time it's a very frustrating and difficult book if you are a scholar and you know the material. There are a number of misinterpretations, a number of mistakes in terms of linguistics for sure, and it's pretty clear from the beginning that Graves has a theory and he's pushing all the evidence to prove his theory. But it is a seductive book. You want to believe in his argument. You know, it's very difficult to sort of snap out of it, even if you know the text well. You know, I read it and reread it in preparation for the book, and I kept on thinking, oh, wouldn't it be nice if it only worked? Of course it doesn't, but he's really good at sort of seducing you with that story. So what Fisher does really here is she takes this intellect, you know, this web of connections, and she reappropriates this intellectual battle. You know, if we accept that the Battle of the Trees is some sort of intellectual, metaphorical battle, she actually makes that into the battle in Chloe's head, where she lies there in a coma, and her frustration, the trees marching, are her anger, are her frustration, because her poetic creativity, she's a poet, she's a budding poet, her poetic creativity goes unnoticed. Nobody pays attention because everybody is absolutely stunned by the art of her brother. Her brother's an artist. He paints. You know, he's visual sort of. They're talking about visual and written again, right? Isn't that interesting? His visual talent is outstanding. So everybody notices that, but nobody sort of notices her scribbling away and having her battle with words. So it's a very opposite way of using really this idea of the poem in this metaphorical in this metaphorical way. And eventually she breaks away, you know, and she sort of manages to wake up from that coma and decide not to, you know, lose herself in the underworld and become the queen of the underworld and sort of rule there. But she decides to go back and rejoin her family. But this time she is self-assured. You know, she knows her art, she knows poetry, and the poetry is going to be her gift, you know, her talent, and she's going to develop that. And interestingly, it's at that point that the Ceridwen and Taliesin, i.e. Vetch and Clare, managed to get on again, you know, and sort of become, stop being mortal enemies, really. Because Ceridwen now doesn't feel anymore that Vetch or the Taliesin has stolen the inspiration from her. Ceridwen, who is the keeper of the cauldron of inspiration, has passed it on to another woman, really. And I think that's important. That's important. We have a male creativity versus female creativity here. And this is a thing where Fisher is actually critiquing Robert Graves as well. For Robert Graves, woman is is a figure to be worshipped, to be put on a pedestal. A poet has to worship, you know, the female principle, the goddess, all the way through his poetry. But that's at the same time a bit patronizing, isn't it? Because it's the man who's writing the poems, it's the man who's creating the works of art. So Fisher here is reversing this. No, it's going to be Chloe who is going to be the poet. She's going to take back the inspiration, reclaim it for the feminine principle, you know, if we choose to interpret the Catgodai and the story of Taliesin in that sort of way, which I think is very opposite for a novel that's written by a woman. So there we are. So it's a very different sort of fantasy from Neff's, of course. As I said, it's more sort of innate, it's more psychological. It's more about these psychological turmoils and dilemmas and sort of inner conflicts rather than those big set battles between big armies and sort of good and evil choices in a large canvas. So high fantasy versus low fantasy, Irish material versus Welsh material, big heroic figures in the first two books versus the more sort of creative hero, really, in the second book. So some really nice analogies and some really nice differences, really, there. Some really nice comparisons and contrasts between those books. Yeah. Okay, so time for another break then before we start breaking everything together and see if I can see any further questions. No, I can't see anything.
I see two questions.
Okay, yes, please.
If I may. The first one is from Alexis Height, and you know I'm a big fan of her work with children's lit. She asks, can children really be considered children when there is little adult involvement in these stories? The children appear to have adult perception already.
So, Alexis, you're talking about both books now, both Henry Neff's and Catherine Fisher's, or one of the two?
I believe she's talking about the class, the whole group of stories that you were talking about.
Oh, I see. So all of the stories we looked at the course plus the ones I'm discussing today. But
yes.
That's an interesting one more generally, because in order to have any excitement, really, in children's literature, you sort of need the parents away, don't you? It seems to be a sort of principle in children's literature that if you want them to go away and have really, really sort of exciting adventures, you either kill the parents, you know, think about Lyra Blackworm, or you send them down a rabbit hole where there's no parents there, or you evacuate them away, you know, from London, like in the Narnia books. There is a sort of common pattern, really, there of the parents either being a bit hands-off or not being around. Otherwise, we would fall into a situation in which the children are very much parented, you know, in a patronizing sort of way. So I think this is more general in children's lit, not just in children's fantasy, actually, anywhere in children's lit, where if you are going to have a proper, you know, adventure, a proper sort of journey to maturity, which, you know, arguably is what children's literature is about, then you do need the parents to be, you know, somewhere a bit further away and not necessarily involved. I think this is all, I mean, I think children's literature, especially, you know, those children's fantasies we've looked at, well, they are about growing up, they are about finding their identity, and especially in those Celtic-inspired fantasies, it is about finding their heritage. I feel quite strongly about this as a motif that actually connects all of these works together. And of course that means that they are, you know, journeying towards this stage of adulthood, and they are often, yeah, as you say, on their own and doing things of their own agency. You know, they are using their own intellectual, physical capacities. So I think it's yes and no. Yes, there is an element of parental intrusion that could stop them, and that's why it's not there. But at the same time, you do expect them to grow, you know, throughout the book. Even in books like the Hounds of the Morrigan, in which the children are the youngest, really, we get in the whole of the books we looked at, they do grow and they do change by the end. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have another question from Elizabeth Hart. She says she was looking up some things about Ogham script when she finished the book and found the pronunciation of the letter in ancient Irish was supposedly correlated with the names for trees. For example, the letter D standing for dur, which is oak. Is that true? Is that not true? Is that incomplete? Can you comment, please?
Goodness, that's another can of worms that I was sort of trying to avoid, but since you asked, we might as well go for it. Well, right. So there are a number of different namings of the Irish alphabet, and there wasn't necessarily one standard Irish alphabet. There are a number of different ones, from Old Irish to Middle Irish, etc. Some of them, I mean, letters, names of letters would be usually objects. You know, if you think about sort of the Phoenician alphabet, which is what we're using today, alpha, beta, you know, aleph, beth, you know, they would be referring to particular things, like Beth is a bull. And in some cases, some of the Irish letters do refer to trees, but by no means all of them, and by no means the same trees every time. And it seems like some of the, if you think again about the Anglo-Saxon runes, we've got is the thorn, it's referred to as the thorn. So it's not uncommon in a number of traditions to have some letters named after trees or any other common objects around. What Graves did was to assume that if some of them have names that refer to trees, then all of them must be, and clearly there is some sort of, you know, one-to-one correspondence between the trees in the Catgodai and the Irish Ogham letters, which doesn't quite hold in a number of ways. First of all, the Catgodai is a Welsh poem. The Irish letters, why really do we assume necessarily, you know, that the Welsh and the Irish are sharing? Well, the languages are completely different at this stage. They're mutually unintelligible. And at the same time, Graves is actually picking up there on an older scholar, Edward Davis, McAllister, who first put that theory, you know, that there's a secret code and that letters are standing for trees. But as I said, there are a lot of modern studies that show that this isn't quite the case. You know, there are some random correspondences, but they're not universal and they're not all the way through. But Graves really runs with it, as he does with everything like this. And not only that, he also, you know, if we're going to explain the crane bag in Darkhenge, there's also another story with Manannán mac Lia, which is a late story, a late Irish story. I can't even remember if we even mentioned it in the course. Did we mention the crane bag? In which Manannán has a bag made out of the skin of a crane bird, and the crane originally was a woman, and it's the skin of a woman, really, which sounds all a bit yucky, but there we are. So in that crane bag there are a number of magical objects, and you can see those objects only if the tide is at a particular position. Okay, so it's one of those magical stories, right? Now, there is also a classical story, I think it is about 2nd, 3rd century AD, in which a Greek hero called Palamedes is supposedly creating letters out of watching cranes flying. Okay, so we've got a sort of 2nd, 3rd century AD Greek story with a supernatural figure, sort of heroic figure, looking at the cranes flying in the sky and creating letters. And then you have a 16th, 17th century Irish tale in which a crane bag hides some supernatural object. So Robert Graves, in one of his typical leaps of faith, you know, between two stories in completely different traditions and with centuries between them, who says that, well, if Manannán mac Lir has this crane bag and Palamedes is watching those cranes like hundreds of thousands of years, hundreds of years earlier in a completely different place of the world, well, maybe the crane bag that Manannán mac Lir had letters inside it. So that's what this is all about, and that's the letters of the trees, and he just meshes it all together really and claims that all of this is associated. And of course, Matthews then picks it all up and he says, what is the crane bag? That's what Ceridwen really had. That's what Taliesin stole from her, and it is the power of poetry. And Fisher uses that, and I think she uses it quite beautifully. What she says is that the bag has words. What is the tool of poetry? It's words. It's taking words and putting them, in a particular order. Who was it now? Shelley or Wordsworth? The poetry is the best words in the best order. One of the romantics, anyway. She uses that to great effect. But if you go back and start scratching, none of this really comes from any of the original material. It is, at least 2 or 3 levels imaginative reinterpretation of this material. Sorry, I went a little bit in a tangent there, but at least that explains the crane bag in Darkhenge.
Absolutely. I have an observation from Chris Swank, who recalls that the crane bag was in The Wizard Children of Finn that we read.
That's it. Yes. So we did mention it. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And it is mentioned in one of the stories as belonging to Finn's father. That's right. Yes. Perfect. Yeah. So it rang a bell that we did mention it, but I couldn't remember when.
We did. May I ask a question of my own?
Of course.
For what age reader do you recommend the books that you have spoken of today?
Oh, that is a funny question.
In addition to you and me.
Yeah, of course, in addition to all of us. That's a difficult question because, I'm always I find it difficult to answer this usually because every child is different and we can't sort of lump them in a bag and say that all children at that age will be ready for that particular text. Each child grows in different rates, etc. I mean, I'm going to give you rules of thumb the way I see it at the moment, but I might change my mind, as my son goes through those ages and tell you, no, I was completely wrong there. But I would think that with the tapestry, you could start, with young children, like maybe at 10, 11. But as they read the books, growing older, and then start going into teenagehood, they will really resonate much more with them as Max grows slowly older. It is the same sort of thing that happened with the Harry Potter books. Harry starts as a child and he becomes a sort of teenager, and the generation that read it during those ages, it really worked for them. With Darkhenge, it's definitely for teenagers, and I would say probably slightly older, sort of in the middle of the teenagehood, whatever we call that period, because it is about that period when you are experimenting with creative modes, and there is all this angst and this jealousy and rivalries between teenage siblings. So it is a little bit darker, although the tapestry does become darker later on. Again, I'm not going to give away too much. Yeah.
All right.
Not a definitive answer, but there you are.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Folks, quickly scribble in your questions. We have about 8 minutes left. Do you have something Do you have something to wrap up with, or are we?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a nice picture of all 3 of them here, sort of
Please do.
To bring them together. So this is the first 2 books of the tapestry. Again, just keep on reminding you really here that this is only the beginning of a longer series, and then we have Darkhenge on the right. I think it's a nice, it's a nice top up really to the course, because it gives you, one example of its tradition, because it does give you 2 different perspectives, from an American author who's writing without necessarily any, so Henry Neff has in his, I did publish his interview, my interview with him in my blog, so maybe I should send you that link as well, Sparrow. But one of the questions I asked him was, is there a personal connection with Ireland there? Do you have Irish grandparents, or is there a connection, is there a family connection? Why did you feel this urge to write about the Irish material? And interestingly, just like Lloyd Alexander, there is no family connection there. With Lloyd Alexander, we know that what happened was that he came to Wales, during the Second World War, and that's what triggered it. With Henry Neff, it was the exoticism of this material, the fact that it was so different to everything else he'd read before. The fact that nobody had really done it well, you know, he felt that the Cuchulainn story hadn't really been taken up and done, you know, in that sort of world-building fantasy genre before. And so it was uncharted territory in a way for him. It was a way to be original. It was a way to be creative. And of course, Cuchulainn is such a compelling hero, and it's so easy to get him wrong. But I think Henry gets him right. He really does get him right. I said, bear with me there and read the rest. And for Katharine, again, there is something a bit unusual there, because Katharine does write a lot. You know, there is another book of hers called Corbinic, which is a sort of Arthurian-inspired book. But for me, Darkhenge is probably her most, you know, her closest book to sort of this reuse of the Welsh tradition in the same vein, I would say, as Alan Garner or Jenny Nemo. Although what she does different to them is that she does not use the Welsh landscape. We are in Avebury, but at the same time, you know, we saw sort of these megalithic, you know, big megalithic monuments referenced in those children's books a number of times before. We saw them in the Hounds of Mabinogion. We saw them in the Legend of Finn. We saw it in, God, I'm missing something important here, in the Darkest Rising series. And they are also actually later on in the Tapestry series, we also get, you know, this stone circle, this sort of megalithic monument. So for Fisher to make that connection is, again, continuing this link between monuments that are actually a lot longer, you know, a lot older than you know, the peoples that we would conventionally call the Celts, you know, the Iron Age inhabitants, you know, of Britain before the Anglo-Saxon invasion. But this image of the henge, you know, remains influential and interesting. As I said, both of these, the Tapestry and Darkhenge, are using it. So all of those motifs that we've seen in the course, you know, continue to play in all of us. The figure of the druid as well, you know, the vetch as a druid really here, or possibly sort of druidic elements in some of the characters in the Tapestry. Again, I'm not going to reveal too much here. So all of these motifs, you know, keep on coming back, and I think it's the pleasure of recognition in those books. Is the pleasure that we understand, that we recognize the stories, the old stories that they're retelling, but it's also the pleasure of the new. What are they doing differently that makes them so successful?
Thank you very much. I have another question from Alexis and an observation from Jewel. Alexis asks, is children's literature within the age range that it is planned for darker if it's based on myth or legend or folklore? Do you get that general sense?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a really good question.
And may I...
It definitely has the potential to be darker, because these stories, you know, these myths and legends were not intended for children. They really weren't. You know, these were stories that were believed as true very often. They expressed, you know, some of the fears and anxieties of the societies that told them. So there will always be a darker underbelly to these stories. But then even the original folk tales that later on became, you know, what we know today as fairy tales had a darker side. So I think those have the potential to be dark as well. Yeah, there's definitely the potential there.
Fantastic. And that dovetails with Jewel Morrow's observation from what you said about the inner castles in Catherine Fisher's work. She thinks perhaps we need to be at least 40 to be ready for Darkhenge.
Fair enough. Fair enough, yeah. I'm not sure I would like to be down there, to be honest with you. I just find it a little bit scary, but that's the whole point, you know. I think I was a bit old when I read it, to be honest. I should have read, you know, I would have been better if I'd read it as a teenager, because you do relish a little bit of this darker side. And yes, as I get older, I get more and more scared, more and more easily. So
I understand. And I would love to tack on a question of my own. Until Rick Riordan started publishing books about Norse and Greek and Roman myths in the world of children's literature, I don't think that many traditional myths were part of the American education system. What is it like for British students because you speak of that recognition of the old stories.
Yeah.
Does Alexander know the old stories?
Yeah, well, he does because he lives in Wales. I think it's got to. It is a regional thing, really. It is. So Welsh children will be doing versions of the Mabinogion, sort of retold for children, and then later on, possibly, in translations from the originals. And definitely the, stories, mythological stories from the Irish tradition are used in the Irish educational system. England, not that much as far as I understand. It's more about Shakespeare and sort of the literary tradition. I don't really hear much Beowulf being covered. Sometimes, you get the odd Sir Gawain and the Green Knight or Canterbury Tales, but these sort of older medieval tales, definitely in the locality where they were born, they are important and they are culturally significant and they are part of the educational system. Even if you don't know them really well, you recognize them. There is something, that will bring back memories. And, in Wales, we are quite, there is a pride about being part of that tradition, really, and the same is true for Ireland, not just in the educational system, but later on, there is all of this movement to support the Welsh language, and that comes with the texts that are associated with it. So, yeah, it's not consistent, but it's there definitely in Ireland and Wales.
Very good. And we have an observation from Kate Neville that now she is very excited and intrigued to search for Native American myths and illusions in American children's lit. I think that would be an awfully fun project.
That sounds amazing. Yes, absolutely. Has anybody done a course or a seminar on American gods for Signum? Has that come up?
I think not yet.
That would be a good
key on the yet. Wouldn't that be a fun class to take?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
It is 5:30 here. We have. Alexis says we must do a Neil Gaiman course, and absolutely, I think it is time. But I know it's 10:30 where you are. It's late. We are so grateful, and I have 3 or 4 folks who have just popped in to say thank you. How wonderful. We always enjoy hearing about books from you. Folks, remember to download that handout. It includes the link to Dr. Fimi on Goodreads as a Goodreads author so that we'll know what she's reading and we can follow her recommendations and perhaps recommend new books. Alexis says, thank you, fantastic info. Andrew, thank you. Takako Tasai, and lovely just listening to you, says Kate Neville. Emily Austin, thank you to everyone who put this together. And to be honest, you could read aloud the phone book and we would be enthralled.
Really not.
But the books that...
It's always
absolutely. Thank you so much. Good night, everyone. Travel safely if you have to travel.
Thank you very much. Night.
If you enjoyed this seminar, please consider making a small donation to Signum University. Your gift will help us continue to make the seminar series and other great content available for free to the public. Just go to signumuniversity.org/fund/donate/seminars. Thanks!